Hi, this is Dennis Weiss for Eagle Communications, but we're here to talk about why Like Ike. We got a couple of fresh faces over here ready to do business. We have Tim Reeves holding the microphone and Matt Thompson in the middle. They're the experts today about the top 10 reasons to why Like Ike. You know, Ike had a set of things where he listed his accomplishments as he left office, what he thought really had been done for the benefit of the nation, and there are way more than 10, right, Tim?
That's right. So, I mean, there's a reason some of us major in history, and it's because we aren't very good at arithmetic, and this is one of those examples. But I think, as we mentioned last time, if you would ask Ike shortly after he left office what his greatest accomplishments were, he would have said something like 8 years of peace and prosperity.
Yeah, absolutely.
And as military commander, you know, the defeat of Adolf Hitler 11 months after landing in Normandy. But in the mid-'60s, a number of books came out that began to challenge, you know, his performance as president and as general. And so Ike began to push back, and he did it in kind of a typical Eisenhower way by putting out a list of what he saw as his top 10 accomplishments of 23 items to his surrogates who put the word out on his behalf. So that's what we're picking up today. And one of those was what Ike called the prevention of communistic efforts to dominate Iran, Guatemala, Lebanon, Formosa, now known as Taiwan, and South Vietnam. What he doesn't say in that list is one way we prevented those communistic efforts was through covert operations, which were very, you know, prevalent in the 1950s. Iran is probably the best known example of that. And of course, for years, you know, the government denied that we had overthrown the government of Iran. And that was till in 2009 when President Obama made a speech in Cairo where we basically admitted it. Not that it was a well-kept secret. Eisenhower addressed the coup in his diary in August 1953. And until 2010, if you were a researcher at the Eisenhower Library and you requested Ike's diary, this is what you saw for the date.
A lot of black.
Where he wrote about Iran. An awful lot of redaction. Now that same document, and these are copies, of course, looks like this. And what Ike confided in his diary, I'll just read briefly. He said, "Another recent development that we helped bring about was the restoration of the Shah to power in Iran and the elimination of Mossadegh, who was the president. The things we did were covert. If knowledge of them became public, we would not be embarrassed in that region, but our chances to do anything of a like nature in the future would almost totally disappear." And we did do things of a like nature in Guatemala the following years. A lot of this is all tied to another Eisenhower, what he saw as an accomplishment, and that was the reorganization of the Defense Department. He thought the spending was out of control, that it needed to be reconfigured, and so under what Ike described as his new look policy, the Air Force was enlarged, especially for strategic bombing, which we'll talk about here in a minute, and also covert operations. So nuclear weapons and covert operations were part of that new look policy that Ike enacted.
Let me ask you a level set question. Your topic that you read from the list was to prevent the spread of communism in certain areas. I think it's helpful for people who didn't watch the program last night, like I did on Eisenhower and the end of World War II, to say why he was so motivated to do that.
You really have to look at the entire Eisenhower administration in the context of the Cold War that developed near the end of World War II, largely between the two standing superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. And so much of what Eisenhower did, not just in foreign policy or military policy, but domestic policy, such as civil rights, was all done in the context of the Cold War. And it's almost kind of an international battle, and not only for political supremacy and survival, but for winning the hearts and minds of what they used to call the non-aligned nations, those that weren't, you know, firmly on the side of the United States and the UK and the Soviet Union.
The Third World.
That also known as the Third World, as Matt said.
That's a great point, Matt. And at the program I watched last night, just out of interest, not to prep for you guys, I'm never that organized, but the reality of it is the whole world saw a different view of itself as they approached Berlin. As the Allies approached Berlin,
right.
The world suddenly saw itself through different eyes. And I think the reality of that is probably well addressed in the archives here at the Eisenhower Presidential Library.
It is, and some of those books from the mid-'60s that irritated Ike so much, not just about his performance as president, but particularly about a military commander, were most critical of his decision, and it wasn't just his decision, not to press on to Berlin. And the Soviets instead took Berlin. And so some would, accuse Eisenhower of having, lost sort of that first battle of the Cold War.
Well, there were more than one going on even then.
That's right.
They had a choice to protect the Baltic or go to Berlin. And lifetime of effects from choosing to go north towards Denmark and protect the flank of the Baltic.
That's right.
The Russians were headed there too.
If I may, Tim, I know we're straying far afield, but it's also worth noting that the post-war division of Germany had already been decided upon, and they knew that the Soviets were going to get Berlin, whether or not it was Americans and British who were dying to capture it. So there was some pragmatism behind the idea too, for what it's worth.
That was pretty much settled at Yalta, right?
And Ike would also say, that the Soviets took, a couple 100,000 casualties taking Berlin?
They did.
Would they have rather those have been American soldiers? So, there's a lot to his argument as well.
Right. Okay, preventing the spread of communism. I think as I looked at your notes before we turned the camera on, it's striking to me the area of the world that we're talking about today is the area of the world when this camera is off that the rest of the world is talking about today.
I've looked at a diary entry, I think it's from this 1955, and they were having a national security meeting, and the topics were Iraq, Iran, and Pakistan and Afghanistan. So you can see, those, as you said, that part of the world has been a concern for a very long time.
Matt, what do you got for us?
Well, we have a few items here relevant to the discussion at hand. It's certainly not a coincidence that some of the areas of the world that merit a lot of attention nowadays were ones in which the United States was interfering covertly and overtly. Right in front of me we have a stunning tea service made out of silver. This was a gift from Eisenhower's good friend, the Shah of Iran, after he was installed as a puppet dictator. And in return for this, we were training his secret police and providing weapons and funding and keeping the citizens in line whose democratically elected leader had just been overthrown by the CIA and the British MI6. And of course, this informed some of the unrest that ultimately led to the Shah's overthrow in 1979. So, in a way, this tea service is the gift that keeps on giving.
That's funny. That's funny.
It's
sort of
funny because it's true.
Yeah, funny, sort of funny.
And over here we have a piece of artwork that was given to Eisenhower from the government of Formosa, as Tim mentioned, now known as Taiwan, which during this phase of the Cold War was competing with Red China, mainland China, which was communist at the time, to be officially recognized as the actual government of China. And shortly after this, international support for Taiwan started to wane, and eventually the communist China became recognized as the official representative of that country at the United Nations, and diplomatic relations started switching to communist China. There was less dramatic intervention in this instance than what we would saw in Iran or Guatemala or El Salvador, but it's still an interesting component of the whole foreign policy tapestry that was going on at that time.
I'm pretty happy that I didn't have to make the decision about Berlin. I'm pretty happy I didn't have to make the decision about the leadership in Iran or Formosa, now Taiwan. I found it interesting that people generally use the words that come to their mind the quickest. You said when we were interfering. I would prefer when we were operating in the area, isn't it? But what a great thing it is for the viewers to see us disagree, and here's why. Because the material to make your opinion solid in your mind is here at the Presidential Library. This is such a wealth of knowledge about history that one can use to make up their mind, which is why researchers are here all the time writing books.
That's a good point. I would venture to say, though, that if Iran secret agents overthrew our president and installed a puppet, that we probably wouldn't talk about Iranians operating in Washington, D.C.
No,
we would have
wouldn't
stronger language for it.
Where I come from, we wouldn't talk about them operating very long anyway, because we wouldn't allow that, you see. Great point. Beautiful tea service. I bet there's never been any tea in it. What do you think?
Not since I've been here, but who's to say?
Well, it's terrific. So what's prevention of communism? Gosh, we could hold forth on that for the rest of the day. So what else do you have?
Well, just so that we don't pass them by, as part of that new look defense strategy we talked about that included covert operations, also included nuclear weapons. And we have the two models there in front of you, the ballistic missiles standing upright, intercontinental ballistic missile, and then the Polaris missile, which was submarine-based.
Submarine-based.
And Eisenhower was very proud that both those programs were conceived and enacted during his administration. They didn't just remain on the drawing board. They were actually to make them operational.
I don't know how many missile experts there are out there behind the camera, but this is an Atlas missile, and there are a number of Atlas missiles silo sites in Kansas, across the Midwest, some not too far from here.
And again, you can see, we talked about the international Cold War, so even communities in Kansas would have been impacted because of the construction of those Atlas missile sites. So it's another good lesson in that regard.
Yeah, that really brought the Cold War home to people in the Midwest when they started building these sites and putting these things in those sites, because you now became a target as well.
It's absolutely right.
Sorry, Tim, grabbing the microphone back.
That's all right.
I would say one of the noteworthy aspects of the submarine-based nuclear delivery system was precisely that even if the Soviets were to launch a first strike and destroy every silo that they knew of that was based in North America, there would still be submarines lurking around that could retaliate. And this is part of what informed the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, which theoretically guaranteed that regardless of who attacked first, both superpowers would be destroyed. And you could argue that that's kind of a warped way of keeping from destroying the world, but it worked in this case.
It was totally based on the premise of two rational parties who would not want to be destroyed. That balance inarguably held till this day.
Of course, for it to work, you had to continuously be expanding your armaments.
That's
utilizing the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower spoke against when he left office. But
if it was easy, they would have let me do the whole show instead of you two, you see. So, okay, what's our next topic?
Well, I think we're going to talk about some of Ike's domestic achievements that he included on his list. One was the creation of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, now known as, I believe, the Department of Health and Human Services. When Ike came to office, it was known as a federal security agency. It was kind of an umbrella for a lot of different social welfare type programs. And Ike, again, was such a good manager and organizer that he saw a lot of inefficiencies there, and so combined it under HEW. He was included on his list the passing of the Kerr-Mills Medical Care for Aged Act, I believe was the name of it. And what it really was is the basis for Medicare that was enacted a number of years later. Ike was also very proud of expanding Social Security by 10 million workers, and these were largely self-employed folks such as farmers and doctors and lawyers and dentists. And that's one place where you can really see the difference between Ike, who was always considered a moderate, if not liberal Republican, and some of his more conservative colleagues, was his belief in a larger federal safety net. And he believed in it for an interesting reason that's revealed in a series of correspondence with a friend of his named Bradford Chenoweth, who was a very conservative Republican. And Ike said, we need federal welfare programs because the frontier has disappeared. And this is interesting because Ike was born in 1890, the same year that the Census Bureau declared the American frontier closed. And the reasoning was, and this was very common among progressives of that time, but usually not Republicans, was that since those natural resources are gone, that now government has to step in and play the role that basically land used to play as a safety valve. And it just seems to be one of those things that differentiated Ike from his more conservative friends, including his brother Edgar, who was probably his most consistent conservative critic. And there's this great letter that we like to quote from. And Edgar, was very frank with his younger brother, and always very handy with the free advice. And so he was criticizing Ike's expansion of Social Security. And so Ike wrote back, And he said to his brother, should any political party attempt to abolish Social Security, unemployment insurance, and eliminate labor laws and farm programs, you would not hear of that party again in our political history. There is a tiny splinter group, of course, that believes you can do these things. Their number is negligible, and they are stupid.
And
So that's how
still stands today. There have been several efforts to run at those things, and they have never moved anywhere
And so, yeah, he had
because of that comment.
Yeah, that's right. They use that. It's a pretty well-known quote.
And again, I don't want folks who are just tuning in and going, what are these guys talking about, to not know. And what we are talking about is not the fact that you just read. It's the fact that that information is here in the Eisenhower Presidential Library, available for anyone to read and research.
And draw their own conclusions.
And draw their own conclusions. And that is a gift that is to the Midwest and to Abilene, Kansas, that cannot be replicated anywhere else in the world.
That's absolutely right again. One other thing in domestic policy, and also it kind of straddles defense as well, is the National Defense Education Act. I mean, the Soviets launched the satellite Sputnik in 1957, and there was really a bit of an overreaction in the United States that we were way behind the Soviets in the space race. But it did stimulate this National Defense Education Act, which provided money for students to study math and science and foreign languages. And kind of like the GI Bill, gave a lot of people the opportunity to go to college with federal government support that may not have had that opportunity otherwise. And again, these are all things that Ike saw as among his top 10, 23 accomplishments.
Matthew, I want to talk to you a bit, because you and I have some opinions that would yield over coffee some interesting discussions, I think. So I have defense, welfare, economics, and education. All of these things, Ike moved the bar by either taking direct action or suggestion, or all just the cause of the way politics is done. All of these, other than defense, can be construed as private things as well. That the private world, the churches, for example, have worked on welfare forever. Economics, we're working on it right now on behalf of Eagle Communications. Education, I don't think I'm educating you very much, but you're certainly educating me. So what is the role that Eisenhower and his mastery of negotiation and nuance brought to the federal government to do these things as a federal government? There was very little pushback against those things politically, where we see such an amount today. What do you think the difference was?
I'm afraid that's a difficult question.
Well, that's why I asked you.
Stretches beyond my comfort zone, but hopefully if I answer it, my comfort zone will expand as a result.
There you go.
So, I mean, I think the easy answer would be the fact that there was just a greater spirit of bipartisanship back then. Some of these issues were not as polarizing as they are today. Thinking of things like Social Security and welfare and some of the safety net programs, a lot of those owe their origins to the Roosevelt administration during the New Deal, so they were relatively new. So I feel like it could have easily gone the other way. Eisenhower might have said, you know, this is too socialist, this is a terrible idea, we're going to stop this. And at that point, I mean, you know, many Americans hadn't retired yet, they'd never gotten a Social Security check. So if someone was going to pull the plug on that, that would have been the time to do it. So depending on your point of view, you could argue that he was very prescient in thinking that these might be programs that deserve to be around and deserve to have an opportunity to suit their purposes. I can't imagine that, I don't know the man personally, but I can't imagine Eisenhower ever would have advocated using these to the exclusion of private charities and private non-government efforts to lift people up and give them opportunities to succeed in this country.
I wish I could say that I had known the man, but I do seek to look at what he has done, and this program is an effort to do that and to try to discern something about the man. My opinion as we go into our final minute is Eisenhower was a compassionate man who was, as you have said previously, informed by what he saw in Europe a great deal. And when he came back as a political leader, I think we see a man who was informed by what he saw in Europe. Many of these things the safety net, the walls, the frontier is not there. We can't go homestead anymore. So is an act of compassion, but he didn't force anything down anybody's throat. He led the way to benefits that resulted in the greater good.
Unless you lived in Iran or Guatemala or South Vietnam.
Okay, all right. We have another program coming, folks, so we're going to shut this one down with a spirited defense of the intervention versus the operation in Iran. We so appreciate you watching these programs about Eisenhower, our favorite son. We call this Why Like Ike. We know you would love to come here and to see these artifacts and to do research. If you want to write your own book, I encourage you to do so. Thanks for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you next time right here at the Eisenhower Presidential Library. I'm Dennis Weiss for Eagle. This is Matt Thompson and Tim Reeves for the Eisenhower Presidential Library. Have a great day.